Hey, Fanboy Nation.
This is your pal Daffy Duck, and you're watching.
We're watching Fanboy.
Fanboy, etc.
Fanboy Nation.
I assume Tom.
Paul Taublieb, I think this is the second or third time we've spoken. The first time was definitely for Unchained, the untold story of freestyle motocross. I know I reviewed World of X Games Monster Moments, but I don't remember if we spoke on that one. And here we are talking about Pay Dirt. We are revisiting the story of Supercross.
That's right.
My man, what is it about this sport that draws us in?
You know, drama is about what's at stake. That's, the higher the stakes, the more the drama. And the thing about what draws us in is this sport has high risk, high reward. It's exciting. The stakes are life and death. People know that. And the racing is exciting. The people, the characters, the commitment. And so it has these Shakespearean elements. And I think what I've hoped to do, and I always like to say, I just try. It's up to the viewers to watch it to determine whether I succeeded or not. I don't put it upon myself to determine whether I did a good job or a bad job. That's up to the reviewers and the fans. That this sport has those elements of high drama because the stakes are high.
Now, let's find out real quick the difference between motocross and supercross. Is it just two different companies? Is it a different style of racing? So, someone like me that enjoys to watch it from a distance that would never ride a motorcycle because, I like my manhood intact and I know after the first jump I'll land wrong and it'll end up in my throat. Can you take us into the differences between motocross and supercross so just we have an understanding and, if we're going to be using the terms interchangeably?
Yeah, so they are very similar, but they're also very different. So motocross, which is where the sport was born, and the gentleman who created the sport, who's now in prison, which is part of the movie, the guy who's doing a double life sentence for murder, he was a motocross guy. And motocross is what they call the outdoors. Motocross takes place in natural terrain. They do build a track. They do adapt the natural terrain, but it's done in typically rural areas, and it's very much riding out in hills and dales and natural terrain. Supercross is when the sport was brought what they call indoors into a stadium where a purpose-built track is built. And what happened with Mike Goodwin was he saw the sport existing in the natural terrain environment. It was existing in Europe. This is previous to coming here, and he had this idea because he was a rock and roll promoter. He was this larger than life guy, promoted the Rolling Stones. And the story, which didn't make it into the movie, was he took his girlfriend out to a motocross track in the outdoors, and there was porta potties and dirt and no place to be in the shade. And he proposed to marry her. And she goes, "Okay, I'll marry you, but don't ever bring me back to one of these dirty places. I have high heels. I have a nice dress." And he goes, "I'm going to put this in stadiums. Nobody's really done that." So he moved the sport from the outdoors, which is what's now still called motocross, into the indoors called supercross. And he created that. So there are two sports. It's the same athletes by and large. It's the same manufacturers, but the style of riding is different. The terrain is different. And what's actually happened, which is where the movie sort of ends, is the two sports were kind of rivals. They existed in parallel different times of the year. And now they've come together where you have the supercross season, the outdoor motocross season, and then the best athletes from both come together into a 3-stop tour, which is now called Super Motocross, which combines the two sports. So they're similar but different.
Got it. Okay, so it's not like the rivalry between NASCAR and F1 then?
No. They've actually now combined. They work two separate promoters. One is Feld Motorsports, one is this Coombs family, and they operate separately, but they come together at the end of the year. It's kind of like the old AFL and NFL come together to create the Super Bowl, and that's what you have today.
Well, I like the concept of that, and I'm glad we were able to clear that up because not everybody knows the difference. Are the bikes different between the two, or are the bikes identical?
Actually, the setup is slightly different in terms of the suspension, but they're the exact same.
Okay. So that's the stuff we wanted to touch about, in that aspect first before we get into the depths of Pay Dirt itself. Mm-hmm. When you revisit the sport, 8 years later from the first documentary to this one, what has really changed? Not only in the combination of we get the best of the best between the two sports coming together, but what do we expect to learn in how the sport itself has evolved, like how motocross has evolved, how supercross has evolved, and how they work together to make each other better?
Well, to back up a little bit, the movie Unchained, the untold story of freestyle motocross, which won an Emmy Award, by the way, as the best film of the year when that came out. That's the sport of guys who do tricks on motorcycles. And they typically were failed racers who were free spirits, who created the X Games and all that. So that was Unchained. What's now happened is the sport has become incredibly professional, the sport of both motocross and supercross, where it used to be in the 90s, a lot of partying and, race, but there was kind of a loosey-goosey feeling. What you now have is highly trained professionals who are operating motorcycles at the highest possible level, both in terms of skill, and the other thing you'll learn in this movie is physicality, that the physicality, the training, the dedication that these athletes go under is extraordinary. And one of the sections in the movie talks about that physicality, both mental and physical, the combination. And for example, their heartbeats are between 180 and 200 beats a minute for over 20 minutes. That's more than a boxer who gets to rest a little bit here and there. They get a break after 3 minutes. And you think you're on a motorcycle. Oh, there's a motor, there's a seat. They're not sitting down. Their entire body is an extension of the bike. And you're using your biggest muscles in your body, which are your legs and your back, and then your arms are part of that. So it is an incredibly physically demanding sport, but the mental side also comes out. You have to be focused. You can't make a mistake out there because it's such a technical sport, whether it's motocross or supercross, and we focus on supercross, where everything is compacted in a stadium, where there's whoops and berms and tabletops. You have to be super precise while you're racing guys. They're elbow to elbow. When you look at the start of a race, there's 40 guys at the gate going into a turn where only 6 or 7 people can fit through. So it is a gladiator sport. It's a technical sport. It's a physical sport. And look, let's not mince words. The risks are high. You're moving fast. And, I also did a movie once about MotoGP, motorcycle racing, called Fastest. You would think traveling at 200 miles an hour would be far more dangerous than a motorcycle, a supercross bike, which only goes, say, 40 or 50 miles an hour. But it's not the case, because in MotoGP, which is where the bikes lean over, if you fall, you slide. And there's a long period. Now, I'm not saying it's not dangerous, because people do get hurt. But even though you're going slower in supercross, you come to a stop. And when you come to a stop, that momentum is where the injuries take place. So it's super high risk, it's super skilled, and it's super physically demanding.
A lot of these sports, well, all sports, all start off as fringe sports. Football started off as a fringe sport because someone decided to pick up the ball and run with it instead of what they did with soccer. Same thing with rugby before it evolved to football. MMA coming out of boxing and kickboxing and grappling sports. And, this coming out, this was still a fringe sport. NASCAR, I am more intrigued by the history of NASCAR than I am by actual NASCAR. How, these rum runners made their cars as light and as fast as possible to get away from the cops during Prohibition, to me is far more exciting than watching these, $1 million cars just go around the track umpteen times. I mean, it's still exciting, but not as exciting as the history of it. With Supercross, how has it evolved from, like you said, in the 90s, going from a fringe sport to now a more mainstream sport? It's still not one of the big four, but it's still more mainstream than it was 30 years ago.
Well, let me tell you, you bring up an interesting point, which we touch on in the film. This sport was born. Motorcycles came around in World War I and World War II. They became tools of the military. And one of the things that motorcycles were used for, because particularly in World War I and to some degree in World War II, particularly World War II in terms of this history, how do you get information to the front lines in a fast, efficient way? And you don't want to put it on wires. You don't want, it's hard to get information. So these guys on motorcycles would have dispatches, and they would race to the front and say, here's the orders for the attack or the retreat or whatever. Now, you put a bunch of young men together, and one guy's going to go, I got there faster than you. No, I got there fast. So this sport was born, and it's actually in one of the Ernest Hemingway novels, For Whom the Bell Tolls, where they talk about these motorcycle guys racing to the front, dodging bullets, dodging mines to get the message. So after World War II, you had all these guys who were like, I'm a bigger badass than you. No, I'm a better badass than you. Kind of like the guys from NASCAR, very similar. So they started racing. And and in Europe, motorcycles were more part of the common culture. They were used more on a daily basis. So the sport was embraced very quickly. And there were huge crowds, 50, 60, 75,000 people would go to the outdoor races. And that led to this guy, Mike Goodwin, who was over here, saw what was happening, was a rock and roll promoter, and thought, if I could bring this into stadiums, I could create a new sport. And that, so that you have that history. And then his story was he formed a partnership with a guy named Mickey Thompson that was doomed. And according to the courts, he was then later convicted of a double homicide. And he's in prison to this day. And we interview him from prison talking about how he came up with this idea. But in the first race, which was called the Super Bowl of Motocross, before it was officially called Supercross, everybody thought the Europeans were going to win because they came out of that World War II tradition. And one of the biggest upsets in sports, which we chronicle in the movie, was that very first race. Everybody thought Europeans were going to win, but actually a 17-year-old American named Marty Tripes shocked the world and won the first ever race. And that really kicked off the sport. And in terms of history, at the same time, in terms of how luck happens, a filmmaker who's a big inspiration to me personally, a guy named Bruce Brown, he had made The Endless Summer that sort of kicked off the surfing craze. Well, he had made another movie right at that time in 1972 called On Any Sunday, starring Steve McQueen and a guy named Burt Lawler. And that movie hit and had the same impact with motorcycles when Mike Goodwin created this first race. So there's this rich tapestry of history woven around a murder that kicked off the sport of Supercross as we know it. So it's got a rich history.
It's incredible how certain things like that go into it. You know, like I mentioned, MMA, it took 20 plus years for MMA to get recognized as a mainstream legitimate sport, where the late Senator McCain called it human cockfighting.
Right.
And here we are, it's one of the biggest sports in the world. You know, it's not just the UFC, which is the most recognizable name, but there's one championship and all these other guys. Yep. And now with Supercross, there's Feld that owns a version of it that does their stunt show with it. They also own Monster Jam, and you know, just hauling that dirt in and storing the dirt to take it to stadiums. That's a story unto it. That's a documentary by itself, is loading and unloading the dirt.
And we actually have a section in the movie called Dirt. And the thing about the dirt is, well, let's talk about Feld for a second. When Feld came into the sport in 2009, there were a lot of people in the sport who were very worried because Feld runs Ringling Brothers Circus. And they said, are you going to take this sport and turn it into Monster Jam and turn it into a show? Because this is a very serious sport. And Feld said, no, we're going to leave the sporting aspect to the people who run the sport, which is the AMA and the manufacturers. But we're going to elevate it as an entertainment property. And it took them a little while. They've been very judicious in moving forward. But now they've made it into a spectacle, from the opening ceremonies and the quality of it. But the dirt is a really interesting part of the story. I'm glad you brought that up, because the dirt is like a living thing. When you go to an NFL stadium, every stadium is basically the same. The field is basically the same. Certainly the NBA, Major League Baseball has some quirks, but it's pretty similar. It's not that way in the sport of Supercross. Every region of the country has a different style of dirt. The red clay of the Midwest, the sandy stuff of the West Coast. And the dirt during a race evolves. It's a living thing. Its ruts are cut out. Rain comes down. They'll race in the pouring rain if they have to. And as they race, they're tearing the track up. And so that's one of the aspects that makes Supercross unique, is the ever-changing stage. And it's one of the more interesting parts of it. And we did a whole section on, we show how that dirt is something like 600 truckloads of dirt are brought in. They have to protect the stadium. They move it in and they move it out. So it's very unique aspect of the sport.
Right. And because you mentioned Major League Baseball, and I think I don't know if the rule still applies, but it did for the longest time, where every Major League ballpark had to have the same type of grass and the same exact type of clay or dirt that they played on. So it was an even playing field, whether you were at Yankee Stadium or Angel Stadium, 3,500 miles across the country.
Yeah, and Supercross is, every place you go is different. Some guys specialize. Where a guy grows up, there's guys, and there's like a sand section on a lot of these tracks, and some people are more comfortable in sand. Some people are like, oh my God, I can barely ride in it. So it becomes more of a chess game. And then also, like I said, the track evolves during the course of the race. These tires have big knobs on them called knobbies. And as they're ripping along that traction, as they're doing that, you'll see dirt being roosted up all the time, which means the next time you come around, that track's not the same. And to find a line, okay, there's a rut I'm going to follow, but if I want to pass this guy, I'm going to have to go somewhere else on the track. The next time you come around, it's not going to be the same because 40 guys have just gone over it. So it's, the ability to read the dirt, understand the dirt is a component of the sport, which is unique to Supercross.
Well, yeah, the exciting part about all of this is not only do you make these fascinating documentaries, but it also begs the question, how often do you get on a bike and test the track while you're making the documentary? Or are you like me and are like, let me kick back behind the camera and see how these guys do it?
I have ridden a dirt bike, and I was shooting another documentary once in the sand. And I thought, it's sand. How dangerous could it be? I got on a dirt bike and I hit a small jump, and my shoulder has never been the same. So I learned my lesson. And now that I really understand the sport, and one of the things I hope people take away from the movie is how technical riding Supercross is. They make it look so easy, but it's actually extremely difficult. And mentally, particularly on a Supercross track, it's so compressed, and you have whoops and tabletops and berms, that the mental focus, and we talk about that in the movie, to stay focused for that 20 minutes, and to physically and mentally, while you're racing, you're not just out there battling the track. You've got guys, and it's a physical thing. You're allowed to have physical contact, and it's a gray area. What is too much? What is too little? But there's nothing wrong with banging bars, is what they call it, out on a racetrack. So I do not ride a dirt bike. It's really dangerous. And I've come to really appreciate, because if you're moving along and you come to a sudden stop, that energy is going to go somewhere. And that means it's going to break a bone, the impact. And in some ways, it's more dangerous than high-speed MotoGP.
Right. Now, you have, as the narrator from one of the greatest skating movies ever called Thrasher, Josh, don't get mad at me, I'm teasing. I am teasing. Josh Brolin is the narrator of this. And I bring up Thrasher because you can barely find it anywhere. And that was one of his skating movies, because we talk about X Games, and I was there when Tony Hawk broke the 900 in San Francisco and everything. So don't get mad at me, Josh. I don't need like an angry letter. He
loves Thrasher. He'll be glad you mentioned it.
Okay, good. Because some people are like, when you mention a movie that didn't have the acclaim that it could have, they get upset with that. So I've never met Josh, so I want to make sure I cover my bases. How did you get a hold of Josh for this? Have you worked together before? Obviously Josh is a fan of the sport, but like, how did the connection come through? It was like, I need you as the narrator for this.
There's a bit of I call it sort of an interesting, funny story about that. So I had done a movie a few years ago called Hawaiian, The Legend of Eddie Aikau, which was an ESPN 30 for 30. And we were looking for the narrator. And I do a lot of surfing. That's my personal sport that I do. Surfing is much safer than dirt bikes. It looks dangerous, but your water's a lot softer than dirt.
Right.
By a long shot. But I was out surfing at my local beach, and there he was in the water surfing. And I was looking for a narrator. And I thought, wow, he surfs. It was a story about surfing. And I have to give credit. My wife, Susan Cooper, who's also my producing partner, she called his agent, and the word came back that no, he doesn't do voiceovers. He actually doesn't really like his voice. He's never done that. But we were insistent. I go, no, this is the guy. You can do it. And when we first met him, he was like, man, I've been asked to do voiceovers, but I don't do them. I'm not into it. But we had him do that movie. And of course, he has the most incredible voice, this incredible passion. He understands surfing. He understands dirt bikes. This is the fourth or fifth movie we've done together. So once he had done that previous one when I brought him this movie, but the best part about Josh and me on this movie for me, and why I'm so grateful to him, I was struggling putting this movie together. Originally, I was going to do it in a linear fashion, like a history type thing. And not only is he the narrator, but he truly was an executive producer, and he was kind of a guiding light for me. Because as I was kind of lost in the process of making this movie, he gave me some advice. And he said, Paul, do not try to please anybody in making this movie. Don't think, because I was thinking, what are they going to think? And I couldn't get out of my own head. And he goes, be an artist, make the movie you want to make, and people will like it or they won't. But if you want to make art, be true to yourself, make your pure vision, believe in yourself, and that's the movie people will respond to. And if they don't, that's the way it goes. But trying to please your audience while you're making a movie is a recipe for disaster. And that gave me the confidence to go, okay, I'm going to throw out what I've done. I literally threw out an entire 90-minute edit and rebuilt the movie around, I want to capture the human side of the sport, not the sporting side of the sport. And Josh was really supportive of that. And then it is magical when you write, I'm a writer by trade, actually, and when you write the script and you hear him say these words, and he feels it, he gets it. He rides a motorcycle to this day, and we've since become, fairly friendly over the various movies we've done, because, and over the years he's gone from, Thrashing and other movies to now he's Thanos, and he just did Knives Out. But he loves doing these projects because it's his personal passion.
Well, it's thrilling to see what's come of this documentary, and the fact that these athletes are real people. It's not just some guy that gets drunk every Tuesday and then hops on the bike Wednesday and goes to a show, and then that's just his whole cycle for the week.
Yeah, no, these guys train year round. They're all injured to some degree or other. Their bodies are beat up, and their passion and their dedication and the price they're willing to pay on a human level, on a physical level, on an emotional level. As Jimmy Button, who's one of the more powerful stories, we tell the story in this of a guy who was one of the top guys in the 90s, in the Jeremy McGrath era, and he had a terrible injury. And what that was like to go through that injury and to be told he's going to be a paraplegic and fighting through that. And he talks about his personal transformation. And he goes, I was a selfish guy. I was an athlete who only cared about myself. And by having this horrible injury, which he's now largely recovered from, not completely, he goes, I become a better human being. I'm a better husband. I'm a better father. There's another story we tell in the movie of the great Ricky Johnson, who was on his way to maybe being the greatest rider of all time. He had won multiple championships, won many, many races in the outdoors. And he had a fluke injury on his wrist, a small bone. And it ended his career. And he talks about the bitterness of that and blaming the guy who ran into him, which was an accident. But he also, in the movie, very emotionally says, at the same time, he later got married, now has a family. And he goes, I wouldn't have had that richness of my life if that injury hadn't occurred. Right. So we see the upside and the downside, where you have Jerry McGrath, who had a golden life and to this day is the king and emerged almost unscathed from the sport. So we show the different sides of it.
Paul, I do have to ask this. What did you learn about yourself as a documentarian in making Pay Dirt? And what did you also learn about the sport that surprised you in making this documentary?
Those are different questions. What I learned myself was to be willing to, as they say, kill your babies. To say, I think this is what's important. I think to throw things out and start fresh, to no matter how much work, time, and in this case, money of editing and so on you put into it, you have to say, it's not working. It's not as good as it could be. And whatever the price you pay. And I was like, hey, these guys are risking their lives. Am I going to settle because I'm not, I've done enough? I see what they do. And I said, I'm going to remake this movie and reconfigure it to tell this true story. And the thing I learned the most about in the movie was the relationships between the riders and their fathers and mothers, about how you can't become a motocross guy unless you have the support of your family. And it has a big price, of the relationships and how it develops. And we have some tough stories. Ricky Johnson's father took advantage of him. And, it was a troubled relationship. Whereas Ricky Carmichael, who was maybe the greatest of all time, his mother of all people shaped his career. So it was learning that, in terms of what I learned was they inspired me. If they're willing to work that hard and risk that much, I have to do the same thing as a filmmaker, even if it cost me time and money and so on. And what I learned about them as people was how human they were and how the sacrifices they were. I raised a son who became a professional soccer player. And I thought that was a pretty big sacrifice until I learned what these parents had to go through.
Well, where can we find you on social media to connect with you, to talk about Pay Dirt, the story of Supercross, and just to keep the conversation going? Because I could talk to you all day about this, but I know our time is limited.
Okay. If you want to talk to me personally, I'm happy to talk to people directly. I'm on Instagram and Facebook as Paul Taublieb. That's Paul. My last name is Taublieb. We have Pay Dirt, the movie, Storyofsupercross.com is our website, which has all the social links on there. I mean, if you want to see the movie, which I hope people do, and watching it on the big screen, I'm sure every filmmaker says this, but everybody who's seen this movie, because the sport has never been seen on a movie like this, in a documentary. And so if you go to paydirtthemovie.com and click on screenings, you'll see the list of all the theaters it's being added to all the time, where to go see it. And seeing this thing on a giant screen with the dirt and the sound is the way to see this movie. It will be in streaming come April or so. But we're on all social media. There's a lot of dialogue. People are reacting to the movie. So paydirtthemovie.com, click on screenings, and go see it in a movie theater.
Paul Taublieb, thank you so much for your time today, man. Let's not make it another 5 years before we talk again.
You froze.
I think you froze.
Okay.
There you are.
I said, let's not make it another 5 years before we talk again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm so grateful. And to have someone who's seen a few of my movies, it's very exciting. So I'm in your debt. And thank you so much for your support.